Hi everyone and welcome back. It is my great pleasure to introduce the next panel with a very short and sweet title, Is Your Health Tech Innovation Investor Ready? So before we go on to answer that question with our fantastic panelists, just as a reminder, please do ask questions. We'll do our very best to get to them. But as I've been saying throughout these few days, if you don't ask questions, we're not going to be able to give you answers. So without further ado, I will hand you over to the moderator for our next panel, who'll be able to tell you more. Peter, partner at Potter Clarkson, over to you.
Thank you very much, Becky. Thank you, everybody. Welcome. I'll do some very brief introductions. Obviously, all the details are available on the site, and you can look up their websites. There's lots of details about them. We have, first of all, Dr. Clara Campos, who's the managing partner at Asabis Partners. She's based in Barcelona and active in health tech and biopharma investment. We have another investor, Tom Rascher, I should say, partner at Early Bird VC. Also, he's based in Berlin, active in digital health, medical devices, and diagnostics. We have Dr. Tryggvi Torgersen, the CEO of Sidekick Health, and we have Dr. Hakim Yardi, CEO of Closed Loop Medicine. Just by way of quick background for Tryggvi and Hakim, Closed Loop Medicine are developing a closed loop approach for drug and digital prescription, so that the feedback from different interventions can be used to personalize care for the individual, providing a much faster way of getting an individual to their optimum outcome. Tryggvi at Sidekick Health involved with digital treatment, digitally delivered. They use gamified therapeutics to maximize engagement. And in October 2020, received $20 million in a Series A funding from investors, including the VC Asabis Partners. It's also helpful that actually there is a bit of knowledge of the various people here. I have acted with Tom at Early Birds and his colleagues for several years now. I also act for Hakim Yardi in Closed Loop Medicine. And of course, there we have it. Clara and Tryggvi are connected because Clara has invested in Sidekick. We've got an outline skeleton for this panel discussion. It's going to be a true panel discussion. There aren't going to be any slides, so there's no takeaways, I'm afraid, other than the video that's recorded. And we've set out 4 areas that we're going to explore, and I encourage you to post your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. We're going to deal firstly with the challenges and obstacles to the adoption of digital therapeutics technology. We're going to look at the opportunities for digital health in the current environment. Then we're going to turn to that question of investor readiness. In the light of what we've said on those first 2 topics, what are investors looking for, given our discussion on those points? And then finally, it wouldn't do without, since we've got a patent attorney on the panel as a moderator, to just explore, where does IPR fit in all of that in terms of investor readiness? So I'll scroll back up my list. Let's start. Challenges and obstacles to the adoption of digital therapeutics. Can I ask Tryggvi to just go first and just talk about some of the issues that you see in this area, and how perhaps it's distinguished from digital health and well-being market.
Yeah. So thanks, Peter. Well, first of all, I'd say with the language of digital therapeutics, that was definitely helpful a few years back when people started to kind of define the difference between digital therapeutics and more kind of health and wellness. And so we definitely see that evolution where you are bringing an evidence-based, clinically validated solution to the market. And so that definitely has been really helpful. That doesn't mean we're still in a very kind of early nascent industry. There are definitely interesting challenges to be worked on and solved. That includes just the kind of, by default, the ecosystem that we are working is not terribly simple. We have so many different stakeholders. We have, obviously, it's all about the patients, but we also have all of the other stakeholders, the healthcare professionals, providers, payers, pharmacies, EHR companies, medical devices, and all of these, and each of them kind of play their different roles. And then you have the regulatory landscape, reimbursement, and all of that. And finally, kind of another aspect that I find really interesting in our sector is this interesting overlap between being a health tech medical device, but also a consumer technology solution. So it also has to be a solution that patients can use on a daily basis, is engaging and kind of get that positive experience from using it, just like with any other consumer technology. So these are some of the kind of, let's say, challenges that everyone in this industry is working with, managing all of these different stakeholders. How do they interplay and interact? How do we optimize the distribution channels to get the solutions into the hands of patients, and how do we engage with patients to use them on an everyday basis? And so those are some of the challenges and obstacles when it comes to adoption of DTX in the market.
Thank you, Tryggvi. What's driving adoption? Who's driving adoption?
Again, I think that's just the overall maturity of this whole ecosystem. On one hand, it's the companies like mine who are working in this field. Solutions have definitely been becoming much more mature. I'd say the first wave was not really representative of what the potential that we see in this field, but now we have much more sophisticated solutions, both on the, let's say, the consumer tech part of things, where it really does engage with patients and resonate with them, but then also on the clinical side, where we have evidence-based, clinically validated solutions using big data sets, using AI. So the solutions themselves are getting so much better, which is definitely let's say the main driver, I think, at the end of in the end of driving adoption. But then also the whole market has to, and especially, patients have to get used to the idea of using these solutions. We see a really fast acceleration in that acceptability, especially through COVID. Kind of both. I think who are in the market, we see that, but also if you look at reports like from Accenture and others, across the field, you see rising acceptance of these solutions amongst patients. But then you have the healthcare professionals as well, who have their set ways of doing things, their workflows, and everyone has to be kind of working together on what it means to adopt this technology at scale.
Okay, thanks, Tryggvi. Hakim, over to you. Closed-loop medicine are perhaps going a stage further in terms of digital therapeutics, in trying to align the digital therapeutics with the pharma pipeline, in particular, get your apps and your technology onto the label along with the traditional pharma label. Can you just talk us through the obstacles that you see in your space, and in particular on that point there?
Thank you, Peter. I think Tryggvi's already raised a number of the key challenges that the system has for adoption. One of the biggest challenges is that companies like Psychic, like Closed Loop Medicine, are going through the rigors of a deep clinical evaluation, regulatory processes, and to make sure that we have the highest standards to ensure that we can prove efficacy against or alongside traditional medicines. You can do all of that, but if the infrastructure isn't in place to allow the healthcare professional to even prescribe the solution, then you have a challenge in terms of adoption. And so I think there's an additional challenge that comes from that multi-stakeholder environment that Tryggvi describes, which is the system maturity, the digital maturity to be able to prescribe a digital intervention. And we're seeing certain countries like Germany and places in the US now starting to establish the digital formularies. What we're doing is trying to be able to link the digital intervention, whether that be coaching, wellness, lifestyle, or true digital therapeutic, to the drug label to minimize the dissidence from the current workflow, to enable a clinician to provide through a single prescription an integrated care package of drug therapy and non-drug-based therapy. And so therefore effectively utilizing the pre-existing infrastructure that every clinician is familiar with, which is writing a prescription. Because I do think that for many markets, the challenge is still there, as Tryggvi says, for clinicians to be able to get used to prescribing something different and patients to be able to receive something different. COVID has transformed the landscape in terms of making people more acceptable, but we haven't got that uniform understanding of how these things will come to play. And so our approach to link the two together not only hopefully simplifies the adoption of market access, but provides a more integrated solution for the patient overall.
Thanks, Hakim. Clara, do you, as an investor, do you agree with all of that, and are these issues that you look into when you're doing your due diligence and assessing tech companies coming your way?
Absolutely, and in fact, I think that both Trygve and Hakim is a spot on that, because there are different areas or different types of professionals that are driving adoption, or that you want them to somehow lead this adoption. But the type of deliverables you need to handle to those different professionals or stakeholders are different. So you need to work in all of those. So there's what you need to deliver for the payers to adopt probably has more to do not only with clinical endpoints that can be for MDs, but also logistics or the practicality of how are they going to use or apply that. While for regulators or clinicians, it might be a different thing, more driven by clinical data and what's the real impact or value of that technology or that model or that different way of doing things. And for the user, it needs to be a different kind of deliverable, a different kind of added value. So I think that one of the complexities of these technologies and these companies is just to make sure that you are having a global perspective of it and not too scientific or too business market driven or too regulatory driven. You need to have all this, let's say, talents inside the company and visions to have a complete solution that might be successful.
Thanks, Clara. Tom, I think one of the points you touched upon when we were preparing for this was this distinction between sort of local versus global considerations. I mean, feel free to throw in anything on that's been previously said, but I think you did talk about some of those issues in terms of the tensions they create.
I mean, absolutely. Let me just add one thing beforehand. The word prescription has been mentioned several times beforehand. Prescriptions is usually issued by one individual in all healthcare systems, and that is called physician. We have, for good reasons, I believe, established gatekeepers to make sure that the patients are only receiving what is being validated or recommended through clinical trials, but then by the physician. And I think one of the key things we see here, despite reimbursements being put in place in the various countries, that the prescriptions are not being written. And why is that? Because the clinicians don't know about the technologies, number one, and two, they haven't seen any clinical trials validating those technologies. And one of the things we see quite frequently in all digital areas is that they are mostly catered to a certain healthcare system, i.e. they are care provisioning systems. So I used to say that diseases are global, medical devices are global, and pharmaceuticals are global, but care provisioning is very local. We see no hospital chains really which act across the countries, no physicians' offices chains acting across the countries. You see this a little bit in the aesthetics fields or in the dental fields, but not really widespread. And as they are care provisioning tools, the biggest question one needs to raise as a VC is really to say, how global of a demand is this? So will this, or has this the ability to change the market landscape that healthcare provisioning will be global or at least regional for that matter? And is the US versus Europe, i.e. socialized medicine versus more privatized medicine, the same? And will it be adopted in the same way? Yes or no? I don't have the answers, but most business proposals we actually observe, even if they generate quite some revenues, in particular in the UK, by the way, or in Scandinavia, we see that as well fairly frequently, where they actually generate 3, 5, maybe even 10 million euros of revenues, but they have not reached out and they're struggling to reach out across into another country. And I think that's one thing, being investor ready, the theme of the talk here is that's one thing we severely look at is like, how ready are they to reach out to another market and do they understand it?
Yeah, okay. Hakim, do you have a view? There is this tension between the traditional physician and the structures in which they operate. Is there considerable resistance to the idea of issuing digital prescriptions and then having to manage the data that comes back from that in order to close this path down between giving that prescription in the first place and the end results you're seeking? There's quite a burden on the doctors to have the systems in place to interact with the patient as they start to use the apps or whatever it might be.
I think you're absolutely right, Peter. Is a burden on the doctors, both their time and also to keep up to pace with these types of developments. And Tom's absolutely right. They are the appropriate gatekeeper. But there is a need, therefore, then for quite a significant education of the clinical community to both the way in which these digital therapeutics are being developed, the evidence base they carry with them, and the approvals that sit alongside them. And I think the routes that companies like Sidekick and Closed Loop Medicine are taking is to go through all of the appropriate processes to offer that level of confidence to a prescriber that this has been through, if it's in the UK, the MHRA, or the FDA in the US, and had the appropriate clinical rigor applied to it. That's on the actually making the prescription. And I still think there'll be some build up in terms of the pace at which these technologies start to be used. Although we've seen, as already been touched on, COVID really pushing a need for these types of technologies, more decentralized remote monitoring of patients, particularly with chronic conditions. The challenge is, as you then say, is how do you then feed back? And the one thing I think we spoke about as we prepared for this talk is the challenge of adding to the clinical workflow. That can't be what these solutions do. It cannot be adding more complexity or information to the workflow above and beyond. It has to be a situation where we're writing directly back to a record with appropriate consent and approvals to go through a process that we think about at Closed Loop Medicine of, in the first instance, using these technologies to close the loop, to provide information for a clinician to better inform their decision making. Secondly, to start building on that evidence to be able to get to a position of recommending changes to the care regimen. And ultimately, and the clue is in the title of the company, to get to an environment where we close the loop and can start to do things entirely remotely. But in the first instance, we have to find a way of simplifying that information flow back to a clinician so it's part of their clinical workflow to start informing that decision making. Once they get more familiar with that, I think then you've got a platform to build into more complex and more automated ways of managing patients outside of the clinic.
Thanks, Hakim. Trygve, I'm going to take a couple of questions in a minute, but before we do so, I thought I'd give you an opportunity, since you and Hakim are very much in a very similar space and facing similar problems. See if you want to add anything to that.
In terms of the, could you maybe reframe the question again for me?
Yeah,
please?
we were just talking about the technologies of your company and Hakim's ultimately may require some form of digital prescription. And we were saying about the barriers to that happening, given the current pathways and lack of technology in the doctor's hands.
Exactly, that's right. And just like Hakim was saying, I mean, we really have to respect the complexity levels within the providers of really not trying to upend the workflows within those institutions. That, I mean, I was a practicing physician for many years, and I know that that's a tall order to make any rapid changes there in the workflows in complex institutions. And so we really have to work with that. One of the things we've done at Sidekick is, with that in mind, is we ask the physicians to prescribe the solution, but then it's hands off for them. So we take care of the remote monitoring, the remote interactions and support with the patients, and then we just feed back the information into the hands of those physicians. And like Hakim says, ideally doing that via integration with the EHRs and pushing that data back into their systems. And so that's to us, that's kind of at least the first most realistic step. But what we do see now, especially with COVID, is an acceleration also in the interest of those providers and clinicians taking it a step further and actually starting to operate these platforms to a larger extent. So some of the work that the Sidekick care managers have been doing in terms of supporting patients is now in some cases being done by the care teams on the provider end, where they can remotely monitor patients and remotely support them. And that's, to me, I love that trend. I think that's really going to help capture the full value of solutions like we're discussing here. But I do think it's going to take multiple years before we get there, and it's going to need all of those different stakeholders that I mentioned to kind of integrate, providers, payers, EHRs, and all of these have to work together to achieve that.
I'm going to leave you on. Don't switch your mic off yet, Trygve. I'm going to ask you a question here. It's come up. Do you think innovative culture is as important as innovative technology? And if the answer is yes, what do you do to promote innovation culture within your business?
Wow, great question. We think about that a lot. And especially, I guess, in a company like ours, which is going through rapid growth. I mean, just over a year ago, or 1.5 years ago, there were 12 of us. We're now 53 and adding multiple team members every month. So especially as you grow, how do you maintain that day one mentality, a term we borrow from Amazon? And I really like that thinking. It every single day has to be as if it's the first day of the company, first day of a product, never going to lean back. We're always going to push forward and lean forward, and always keep innovating. So that's, I'd say that's kind of the core of it, always looking at it as day one, never being satisfied on any front. And so when we hire team members, yes, we look for the absolutely highest skill in the market, but also that cultural fit, that eagerness to innovate and lean forward. Another thing we really believe in is that managers' role is really just to pick the right team members and to provide them with all the context. But then at the end of the day, it's the employee who is the expert in their field, and they have to be what Netflix calls the informed captains. They have all the information, but they are the captains in their field. They make those decisions in collaboration with their colleagues. But those are some of the things, but this is something we intensely discuss within the team and are actively, kind of discussing how we best promote that. Again, a great management book. My favorite book of last year was the No Rules book from Netflix, who does touch on many of these things.
Great. I've got a question up here. I'll throw this one at Tom. It's about this tension between clinical validation and market traction that seems to be required by investors of companies. So how does a company demonstrate, without that it's got the clinical validation and market traction at an early stage?
How? I mean, like any other drug or medical device, they will have to go through a clinical trial and show their validation best in the randomized controlled way. I think that's really the way to introduce medical technologies. Now, one can say this is too slow for the kind of technologies we're looking at because it actually takes time, which it does. But I think for a good reason, we don't want people to be exposed with things which either don't work or even in the worst case scenario actually harm them. So, which is likely not going to be the case in digital therapeutics. I get this, but I think this prevention thought and mentality to protect the people is actually a good thing. Again, it slows down things dramatically, and the catch-22 here really is, how do you cope with an innovation cycle which is actually slower than any clinical trials? Or actually faster. So the innovation cycle is faster in that sense. And how do you cope with that? And I find this really difficult to answer, I have to admit. I don't know how to do it, but I mean, I really see any digital therapeutics being really distributed in the same way as any new drug or medical device. It's a door-to-door, convince the physician, then they will prescribe it. And by the way, one of the things we did not say yet is they want a feedback mechanism as well, because once they prescribe it, they want to see after a month, maybe 2, 3, whatever, is that the patient, one, is happy with it. Secondly, it obviously does do something for the patient. So then he will prescribe it the next time, because they're not only relying on the clinical trials they get provided, they all rely on their, what I would call their own little experience world to say, is this working? Is this helping my people? If it does, then I continue prescribing it. If it doesn't, I'll stop.
Sure. Clara, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it's all about confidence, and it has been like this for other type of medical products in the past. But in this particular case, confidence will not come, or we cannot wait until this confidence comes from the feedback, from the results on the day-by-day practice. But of course, we want this data and we want to give that feedback. But at the same time, we need to deliver this clinical data and other things like ownership of the data that is trapped by the company. How is this handled? I think there are additional layers of pieces of work that these companies can do to add to this substantial amount of confidence they need to deliver to to the decision makers at the end, payers or pharma companies, etc. And there are opportunities. I mean, it's a big challenge, as you were saying, Peter, but the opportunities is particularly there. How we build additional layers of confidence to make sure that this adoption is quicker than it has been in other medical products, I'd say. No?
The interesting thing, though, is in that context is in Germany, as you know, they have launched in 2019, end of the year, what they call the Digital Care Act, which actually allows physicians to which allows for reimbursement for certain digital therapeutics, and the hurdle to actually get approved by the medicine agency is rather low, and it's actually constructed in a way that they can actually collect the data for 1 year before they go into what I would call regular reimbursement. So it's kind of like a leap of faith in order to get this done. But that doesn't solve the problem. And this may be coming back to the cultural discussion we had earlier on, because even if you have the reimbursement, you still need to get the physician to prescribe it, because otherwise it's not going to get used. So how do you change the mindset, or maybe the leap of faith in the physicians community to say, let's give it a shot, and I'll be part of this 1 year trial period and try it out. And I think that's the tricky piece, because we see there's always in any community early adopters, even with physicians, and they will try it out, but hopefully there's enough to generate that at least initial support data, I would call it, rather than a real trial. But that's kind of like, when I see this, not only in Germany, this is all over the place. The problem is that you get this leap of faith mostly by governmental organizations because they see the need, so they actually putting programs in place. But then how do you transfer that into those who actually need to do it? That's the biggest question I have.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. We need to keep things moving, because I'm conscious that at some point we're going to have to start giving some advice and some insights into how to be investor ready in this space. Trygve, can I just turn to you, because we've touched on this, COVID-19 is clearly a driver in many groups' minds now. What's happened over the last year that perhaps has created further opportunities for adopting this technology and generating the sort of interest that will bring in major investment?
My feeling is that acceleration has really been across the board, starting from the patients, and the patients themselves have gotten much more used to using all types of technology throughout the past year, including in many cases, digital health technology in one form or another. So patients are definitely becoming much more open to this. Clinicians very often as well. Very often they have obviously had to cancel their on-site, a lot of their on-site work, and have been kind of forced in many cases to use different types of technology. And so they definitely, in my view, have jumped forward by, I'd say, 2 or 3 years in many cases in terms of readiness. And that goes down to individual clinician level, but also up to the kind of provider structural level. The same going for payers. I mean, payers have been maturing and getting more ready, I'd say, over the past 3-4 years. I've never felt the level of readiness as basically just at the beginning of this year. I just feel the kind of how the payer field is really taking off in their adoption and readiness here. And I definitely feel a leap forward with COVID there as well. And then plus, of course, as I said, investment has been picking up. The solutions are getting better. So I'd say absolutely across the board, COVID-19. My personal feeling is it's accelerated our industry by 2 to 3 years, I'd say, in many cases.
Thank you, Hakim. Would you share that view that the opportunities are there now, that you're not pushing water uphill so much as you used to be?
I think that's definitely the case, and just echo what Trygve has said. I was on a call in the middle of COVID run by the BIA, the Bioindustry Association here in the UK, and the CEO, Steve Bates, actually quoted Lenin, of all people, and said there are decades when nothing happens and there are weeks when decades happen. And it very much feels like a decade's worth of adoption of innovation has been driven by COVID. Not just for the need, I think, in terms of better decentralized care for those patients who are shielding, but something else has happened, which Trygve touched on, which is a mass education. a mass education of the importance of remote monitoring and timely intervention, which for chronic disease management translates very effectively from vaccine and infection monitoring. And I think we can't underestimate that mass education of patients, population, and physicians, as well as then the challenges placed on the health systems going forward, who are going to be under huge financial pressures and are going to be looking for better ways of delivering care to more people. And so it's a driver, as Trygve says, on so many fronts.
Thanks. Right, we're going to give the investors the opportunity to be put in the spotlight here. Investor readiness, what are they looking for? What are you looking for, given the discussion we've had so far about the opportunities, the challenges, and the drivers for this? Clara, would you mind going first?
Sure. So what are we looking for? I think, I mean, it can be very broad, but first, the opportunity needs to be disruptive, technological wise. I mean, it needs to be something that aims to have things being done in a different way. I think that's key in the selection of investments we do. But at the same time, then you need to have a clear business model, even if it's not yet put in place. At least there needs to be a roadmap on what you are going to do with that in terms of market implementation and adoption and all we have discussing. And again, let me insist, we really like and we can invest really early. So from a service, we are doing very early investments, but we need to make sure that at the time of the investment, we have had discussion enough with the management team of the company to have a clear roadmap of what we want to achieve in the short term, in the mid-term, and in the long term, even if that's not in place yet. Let me insist on that. And we've done that in the past. So in investments such as Sidekick some time ago, and also in Caracare in Berlin, we have been investing in companies that have a very clear idea of what they wanted to do, what they were doing, what they wanted to do in the near future, and a strong team that was capable to put that together and to convince us that that was the good roadmap to be put in place. Scalability, we have been discussing that also from different perspectives, but a team that is capable to scale up that, so a business model that can be scaled up some way and moving from the global to the local distribution and implementation. And I think that's key. And when I say disruptive, means something that can really add value in a disruptive way. So it's not incremental innovation, which is fine, but it's not what we do from venture capital. It needs to be really substantially different on the way we are doing things. I think that it might sound a bit strange because digital therapeutics, it's disruptive per se, but we start seeing companies in our deal flow that really are incremental innovations, which it's not in our sweet spot. We really want something that wants to make things different.
So Clara, you've seen the questions coming down the panelist thing. There's one there, can you share some top tips for closing an investment round in the health tech space specifically? Have you got a couple of top tips that you can point to, that are things that float your boat when people are hoping to close an investment round with your venture capital fund?
I think that it's key to be very, very strong in your position on what you really know. But at the same time, very open on this piece of work we don't know. We need to build that together. So we are the type of investors that like to be part of it. It's needed to bring talent, not only from our teams, but also from around the world to sit down on the same table and to build together that potential company. So I think that being clear on this is our idea and then let's discuss it, I think that's clear. And I would insist in the scalability, as Trygve was saying. At Sidekick, when we invested, there were like 12 to 20 people. Now it's more than 50, whatever, and about to be 70 in very soon. So I think that this needs to be managed somehow. It's not easy. You need to bring those people, to make those people part of the team, to give them the idea of what you want to do in the company and to move that together. So it's not only about money of investment. It's what are you going to do with that money when you close the round. And also syndication, it's key. I think that we love being leading these rounds or being part of these early stage rounds that we have been in the two companies I mentioned. But it's very important to choose what do you have in the board. And I think that a mix of clinical perspective or life sciences perspective with some payer perspective or some technology perspective, it's key. So you need to balance it, and the knowledge of the management team is also one aspect to take into account. So you need to complement the whole thing to make sure that you have different levels of teams that can make good decisions at a certain point.
Thanks. Over to you, Tom. Same question. What are you looking for? Given the issues we've talked about. I know I can speak for you on this point that very much part of the early bird investment cycle is to provide a lot of value add to the companies. I've been involved with that, so I know you look to give more than just the money. But talk us through.
I mean, it's actually, if you look at health tech investments, we're looking mainly for three things. They don't need to be ready and there yet, but that's something which we want to see. We want to see outcome improvement. Show me the outcome improvement. It doesn't need to be proven yet, but you need to have a thesis and a theory around this, where the outcome improvement will be. And as Clara was saying, it needs to be significant. So a smaller convenience improvement is not something we would be looking at. It really needs to be a dramatic outcome improvement. That doesn't mean necessarily longer lives. That is one outcome improvement as well, but it could be providing care at different places or better access or anything like this. And that theory needs to be proven, and then the endpoint needs to be defined. Again, not yet proven probably, but then on the course. So we'll do that jointly. I think that's one thing which really is important to us. The other thing is differentiation. So how unique is this technology versus others? How many competitors are on the market? Are they having any traction in other markets? Is there any intellectual property? And that's not only patents, it could be done through data, unique knowledge and all of that. So what makes you different? I think that's a key question, because most of the times in health technologies in particular, be it mental health or something like this, everybody is defining their own niche, but at the end of the day, they're very comparable. So what is really different, I think, is one thing which drives us most. And then the last thing, internationalization. It's not enough in our view to have a good technology catered to a certain healthcare system. It needs to be applicable to other healthcare systems. Again, that needs to be, it's not to happen already now, but I would like to see the team having thought about it and actually having a plan and actually having talked to other people, that they have a little bit of input on that, what the next steps in internationalization will be and how this is likely going to pan out. This is, again, it's all a path. Nothing is done today. We are investing in a phase which usually those things are not done yet, but we would like to see at least some thinking around that.
Tom, one of the things I've observed is tech investors moving into what I would regard as more traditionally life sciences. Digital therapeutics has a definite leaning towards the life sciences. And the pharma pipeline requires years of clinical trials, approval, and so on. Do you think tech investors are good at seeing the long term when they know they're going to have to get through to a point where they pay for trials, or find a company they're going to collaborate to pay for trials? Sorry.
That proof is in the pudding, I'd say. I don't know. I'm biased, I have to admit. I think I certainly believe that if you know the healthcare systems and understand healthcare, it's helpful rather than a hindrance. Whereas the tech guys come from the other side of the angle and say that knowledge is actually a hindrance and you will not innovate really in healthcare once you know too much about it. My bias is actually it helps if you know a little bit about healthcare, but that would be me. I'm not saying that I'm right, but I have heard both sides of the arguments.
I'm going to give Final a Hakim word on this point. He looks like he's itching to say something.
No, I just think it's a really interesting question. Certainly what we've seen over the past few months is these different camps of investor base, the traditional life science investors, the more tech-focused investors, and then a growing number who are converging on this interface, and digital therapeutics fits nicely within it. And for a lot of funds, this space is slightly out of scope, but they can see it growing, they can see the importance, but most of all, they can see the value add to health systems, to patients. But not everyone has got the ability to deploy funds in a way that innovates in the cycles that Sidekick and CLM are innovating, but also working to a regulated environment. So I think we're going to see more, not less, investment capital coming into this middle ground, but it is interesting to watch who is moving.
Yeah, thank you. Clara, I'm sacrificing time to talk about that most interesting of subjects, intellectual property. But I want to ask you a question that's come up here. You know, what specific areas of health tech do you see as especially promising?
Everything that has to do with therapeutics, I believe, in general, is a driver for us. So chronic diseases or management of chronic patients, it's for sure something that can be added value. Everything related to mental health, we have also a couple of investments in that field, and that's important. And perhaps in mental health, this is one of the places when you can really go for with this digital therapeutics, in terms of you have something that cures you independently of anything that has to do with a drug or a device or things like that. No, it's really straightforward. Although you can do that in other therapeutic areas, but I think mental health is kind of really, you are changing the way your brain and your neurons are distributed due to a digital technique, let's say, or a digital app or whatever. So I think that this will also help driving adoption, or some of the drivers we just discussing. And these are the most interesting areas in our site at that setting, but there are much more others racing around there, and that will probably surprise us in the very near future, I would say.
Thanks. Tom, back to you. We're going to move on and briefly talk about intellectual property before we wrap up. Where does IP fit in all of this? The tension between protecting things that are in software, perhaps machine learning environments, keeping it trade secret versus patenting, ownership of data. You know, how far do you dig when you're looking at the intellectual property of a tech company in the space?
I mean, first of all, I think when we look at health tech companies, one of the first things we do is we scan the market and see what competitors are out there. Interestingly enough, usually in the decks we receive, we only see like a handful of competitors. Once we start digging, we find 25 in various countries. So there's plenty. I think that's really, and be honest here. And I think the second thing is intellectual property. When you look at AI technologies, it's all about the data sources. So what data sources do you have, and how unique they are, and how big they are, and will they be sustainable over time? So that to us is a fairly significant uniqueness. The other uniqueness piece you can get is if you have contracts, i.e. if you have secured contracts where you have access to customers for a period of time, maybe exclusively for a year or two. So that gives you a little bit of a advantage movement into the market rather than others. So those are kind of protective measures. When it comes to patents, this is really difficult, and honestly, we are struggling with that. We are used to be a patent-oriented investor, i.e. make sure that your technology is protected. We have learned and understand that this is not possible in most of these investments, and therefore we look at traction and the market readiness, as I described early on, because we believe that will actually be then kind of like the protection you get by facts, i.e. you either have traction in the market, or you have data sources which are unique, or anything in that area.
Thanks. Hakim, you positioned yourself and your company quite differently. Patents are important to you. Can you just say a bit about why?
Absolutely. So for us, developing a combination product, we've got the opportunity and ability to think about novel ways of protecting both the drug and the digital, and bringing those together. And one of the reasons for doing this is obviously for protection, but in terms of the partnership, the ability to bring a drug to market for an early stage company like ours will be somewhat limited unless it was in partnership with pharma. And for us, pharma are our partners. And what do pharma value? They value IP, they value regulatory protection, and they value the clinical evidence. And so for us, a lot of our approach has been built on a foundation of IP, regulatory, and clinical evidence as a foundation for what we can build and protect.
Thanks. Well, look, our time is up. We could have gone on, I'm sure, on each of those topics a lot longer. Sorry, the IP section was a bit short, but I thought the conversation we were engaging in earlier was probably of more benefit to the listeners. So just thank you for everybody on the panel. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to hand over to Becky just to wrap up.
Thanks so much, Peter. As you say, as always the way, 45 minutes goes so quickly, but hopefully that's given everyone a flavour around the topic. And again, I do encourage everyone to reach out to all of the panelists and all of the speakers and attendees that we have today and make those connections and carry on those conversations. So thank you once again to Peter and all the panelists. And I will see everyone back here in a mere 15 minutes for our next session, Innovation and the Future of Chronic Disease Management, where we have a fireside chat between Glenn Tillman, founder of Livongo, and Tina Tan, executive editor at First Word Healthtech. See you then.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I've got to jump